Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled we're digging into this today because we're looking at a story you probably think you know inside and out. I mean, when we think of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, the very first image that flashes to mind is the heroic athletic triumph of Jesse Owens, right? But as you'll see today, that's really just the surface. That familiar story is kind of just the visible tip of an iceberg, a much larger, much deeper battle against systemic racism and fascism. We're going to explore how these games became a massive flashpoint for fierce, coordinated resistance, and not just from within the stadium, but from activists working tirelessly back home.
So when did the civil rights movement actually begin? It's a provocative question, isn't it? We usually think of the post-war era, the 1950s and 60s, as the real starting line. But to truly understand this history, we kind of need to reframe our perspective. Coordinated resistance against racial ideology found its voice way before that. The events surrounding the 1936 Games serve as this powerful reminder that the fight for equality was already being waged on a global stage using some deeply sophisticated strategies.
Okay, let's dive into this and map out our journey. First up, a propaganda masterpiece. Second, the American boycott debate. Third, defiance on the track. And finally, a prelude to freedom.
Section 1. A propaganda masterpiece. Let's set the macro, international stage of Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
This was literally the ultimate propaganda coup. When Nazi Germany got awarded the 1936 Summer Olympics, Adolf Hitler and his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, they saw an unprecedented opportunity. They fully intended to use this global stage to showcase their dangerous myth of Aryan supremacy to the world. But honestly, what's even more chilling is that they designed this whole spectacle as a veneer of hospitality. All that athletic grandeur, it was deliberately constructed to temporarily mask the regime's brutal, systemic persecution of Jews, Romani people, and political dissidents. They wanted the world to see this welcoming, powerful nation, completely hiding the terrifying reality of their tyranny.
And the escalation leading right up to the Games was just incredibly tense. Germany secures the Games, but almost immediately after, Nazi officials start actively debating banning black and Jewish athletes entirely from competing. And this wasn't some secret behind-closed-doors thing, it was a very real, looming threat. But that threat sparked this immense international pressure, so much so that the regime actually backed down. The Nazis were terrified that the United States and other Western nations would just completely boycott the Games, which would have utterly ruined their grand spectacle. It's actually fascinating to see how global pressure forced a totalitarian regime to fold, at least on the surface.
Moving on to Section 2, the American boycott debate. We're zooming in from the international arena to this fierce domestic debate that erupted in the U.S. months before the first torch was even lit. Should America send a team to a fascist dictatorship practicing racial tyranny? Well, this wasn't just a hypothetical exercise. Prominent black newspapers, places like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, alongside civil rights organizations and grassroots activists, were actively and very publicly wrestling with this exact question. They were setting the agenda and really forcing the nation to take a long, hard look in the mirror. For example, Amateur Athletic Union President Jeremiah Mahoney put it incredibly bluntly. He said participating in Berlin was a direct endorsement of Hitler's regime. He saw zero neutral ground here. If you show up, you legitimize the host. Now, obviously, we know from history that the boycott ultimately fell short, and the U.S. team did travel to Germany. But the sheer intensity of this high-stakes public debate did something absolutely incredible. It galvanized an entire generation of activists. And this brilliantly illustrates a really bitter hypocrisy. American politicians and media were eagerly cheering on black athletes, hoping they'd disprove Nazi racial theories on the world stage. Yet those exact same athletes had to return home to the crushing reality of Jim Crow segregation, systemic disenfranchisement, and the sheer horrors of lynchings. Activists used the Olympics to put a massive, glaring spotlight on this super uncomfortable contradiction. All right, Section 3. Defiance on the track. Let's zoom all the way into the stadium itself and focus on the athletes and international observers who absolutely refused to play along with the Nazi script. 4. That is the number of gold medals won by African-American athlete Jesse Owens. It was a total visual mic drop when Owens, along with teammates like Mac Robinson, completely dominated the track and field events. They did way more than just win some medals. They fundamentally shattered the myth of racial hierarchy right in front of Hitler's own eyes. The physical reality of what happened on that track completely dismantled the propaganda. No debate needed. But, resistance wasn't just happening on the track. It was really a multi-front effort.
Behind the scenes, European anti-fascist networks, foreign journalists, and athletes were constantly engaging in these quiet acts of solidarity. They were bridging racial and national divides and openly flouting the regime's rigid segregationist and anti-Semitic social rules. And then there is the truly remarkable legacy of the press box.
Let me introduce you to the journalists who embodied that legacy. Wendell Smith and Sam Lacey were black journalists covering the games, and they were just brilliant. They used their platforms for so much more than just reporting on sports scores or who won what heat. They meticulously analyzed the parallels between the two nations, drawing a direct, undeniable line between the fascism on display in Berlin and the systemic racism happening right back in the United States.
The true legacy of these guys was profound. They forced readers back home to confront the uncomfortable truth that fighting fascism abroad meant fighting bigotry at home. They basically weaponized the sports page to deliver these incredibly powerful journalistic critiques, laying down crucial media strategies that would become so vital in the years to come. Which brings us to Section 4, a prelude to freedom. Let's zoom back out to examine the macro legacy of the 1936 Games and what this all means in the broader context of global civil rights.
Look, it's really important to be realistic about the outcomes here. The 1936 Olympics did not stop the horrors of the Holocaust. And it certainly didn't dismantle Jim Crow overnight. We can't overstate what one single event can achieve against deeply entrenched systemic horrors. But look at what it did do. The protests, the sharp journalistic critiques, and those courageous athletic performances, they exposed the deep, deep fragility of racist ideologies on a global stage. It proved that these supposedly ironclad systems of supremacy were actually incredibly vulnerable to defiance.
When you step back, the sheer variety of this resistance is just staggering. Defiance took the form of a sharp investigative article dissecting hypocrisy, a fierce public debate over a national boycott, and a record-breaking sprint that literally shattered a dictator's myth. Every single one of these actions served as an indispensable stepping stone for the media strategies and the broader civil rights movements that would flourish after the war. So I want to leave you with this final thought. If historical resistance against some of the darkest regimes in human history can take the form of a sprint on a track or a smart article in a newspaper, what form does it take today? How does the activism of the past shape the tools we use in our world right now? It's a fascinating question, and I really hope this explainer has given you a powerful new framework for thinking about it. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible piece of history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.